the summer that Miriam Voss turned 37. The lake dried up 2 weeks earlier than anyone could remember, and she stopped locking her front door. Not because she'd stopped being afraid, but because there was nothing left worth protecting. The Voss farm sat at the end of a gravel road outside Sundre, Alberta, a stretch of land her late husband Colin had inherited from his father and his father before that. 3 generations of hard men who'd pulled something living from land that didn't give easily. Colin had been the last of them. He'd died on a Tuesday in March, 4 years ago now. Tractor gone sideways in a ditch he'd crossed 100 times before. The paramedics said it was fast. Miriam had never entirely believed them, but she'd stopped arguing with what she couldn't know. She had 2 children. Owen was 12, quiet and watchful, the kind of boy who noticed things before he said them. Sophie was 8, and made up for her brother's silence by filling every room she entered with question and the occasional catastrophing. They were the reason Miriam got up before the sun, the reason she kept the garden going, even when the soil turned stubborn, and back twice a week minutes into town, and back twice a week. The farm was hers. The debt was hers. The loneliness was hers too. She didn't think about any of that on the morning she found the man. It was early September. A thin frost had come in overnight, the first one of the season, and it lay over the fields like a secret the earth was keeping. Miriam had gone out before breakfast to check the fence line near the east pasture, where the posts had been working loose all summer. She carried a coffee thermos in one hand and a hammer in the other, and she was thinking about nothing in particular. Then Sophie screamed from somewhere behind the barn. Not a playing scream, not a startled scream. The other kind. Miriam dropped the thermos and ran. She found Sophie standing at the edge of the old irrigation ditch, both hands pressed to her mouth, eyes enormous, and there in the ditch, half buried in dead grass and dried mud, lay a man. He was on his side, one arm folded under him at a wrong angle, his jacket ripped at the shoulder. Blood had dried dark along his collar. "Is he dead?" Sophie whispered. Miriam crouched down. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. The pulse was there, slow and uneven, but present. "No," she said. "He's not dead." He groaned then, a low sound that came from somewhere underneath the pain, and his eyes cracked open. They were gray, and for a moment they focused on nothing at all. Then they found her face. "Don't move," she said. "You're hurt." He closed his eyes again and didn't argue. His name, she found out later, was Fletcher. He had no wallet, no phone. He had a set of truck keys in his jacket pocket and a folded piece of paper in his shirt that turned out to be a handwritten list of hardware items. He also had 2 cracked ribs, a deep cut above his left ear, and a shoulder that had been dislocated, and then, from the look of it, shoved back in by someone who knew what they were doing but hadn't been especially gentle about it. She and Owen got him inside between them, Owen taking the man's good arm over his shoulders without being asked, his jaw set the way it got when he was determined to do something useful. They put him in the spare room, the one that had been Colin's study, and Miriam called Dr. Arnett in Sundre, who drove out that evening and confirmed what she already suspected. Nothing that required a hospital, everything that required rest. He should stay still for at least a week, Dr. Arnett said, snapping her bag closed. Ribs like those don't take kindly to movement. "He can stay," Miriam said, and she surprised herself by meaning it. Fletcher spent the first 3 days mostly unconscious. He woke to drink water to answer Miriam's brief, practical questions. "Does this hurt? Can you move your arm? When did you last eat?" And then drifted off again. Miriam slept in the armchair. In the hall outside his door the first night, she wasn't sure why. She told herself it was in case he needed something. On the 4th morning, she brought him toast and a boiled egg, and he was sitting up, back against the headboard, looking out the window at the empty fields. He looked older than she'd first thought. Maybe 50. His hair was going gray at the temples, and there were lines on his face that hadn't come from easy living. "Thank you," he said when she set the tray on the nightstand. Don't thank me yet, Miriam said. You still look terrible. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Fair, he said. She sat in the chair by the window and let the silence hold for a moment. Outside, she could see Owen crossing the yard toward the barn, head down, hands in his pockets. You have children, Fletcher said. It wasn't a question. 2, Owen and Sophie. Sophie's the one who found you. He looked at the window. How old? 12 and 8. He nodded slowly, like he was filing the information away. And their father? Miriam watched the yard. He died 4 years ago. I'm sorry, he said, and his voice had the flatness of someone who knew what those words actually meant, who hadn't said them lightly. You live around here? She asked. No. He paused. Not anymore. She didn't press. She straightened the curtain that didn't need straightening and moved toward the door. There's more toast if you want it. Owen can bring it. I don't want to be a burden, he said. She looked back at him then, for the first time directly, long enough to see whatever was underneath the careful stillness in his face. You're not, she said. Get some rest. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and Colin's old ledger book, going over numbers that didn't improve with looking at. The harvest had been poor. The equipment loan was due in November. There were decisions coming that she'd been putting off by keeping busy, and the quiet of the house had a way of making them impossible to ignore. She heard a knock, soft on the wall, just outside the kitchen. Fletcher stood in the doorway in the clothes she'd pushed for him, one hand braced against the frame. He was pale, but upright. You should be lying down, she said. I've been lying down for 4 days. He looked around the kitchen, at the ledger, at the single lamp burning. Couldn't sleep. She pulled out a chair across from her. He sat with the deliberateness of someone whose ribs were reminding him of their existence. You don't have to talk, she said. I know, he said. They sat there for a while. Miriam turned the pages of the ledger without reading them. Fletcher turned a mug of tea in his hands, turning it once, twice, the way a man does when his mind is somewhere else entirely. My wife died 6 years ago, he said without preamble. Cancer. We'd been together since we were 22. Miriam looked up. I sold our house in Calgary after, he continued. Didn't see the point of rattling around in it. He set the mug down. I've been working up north mostly. Contracts. Come and go. Is that what you were doing when? No. He looked at his hands. No, that was something else. She didn't ask what. Some things announced themselves when they were ready. In the morning she found him in the yard, moving slowly but with clear intention, examining the loose fence post she'd been meaning to fix. He had Colin's old toolbox open at his feet. You'll pull those stitches, she said from the porch. I haven't yet. He picked up the post driver, assessed it. The post setter's rotted through. You'll need a new one before winter. I know. I can do it, he said, if you have the lumber. She looked at him for a long moment. Are you always like this? He glanced up. Like what? Like you can't stay still unless someone tells you to twice. He considered that. Probably, he said, and went back to examining the post. The days that followed had a rhythm she hadn't expected. Fletcher moved around the farm at his own pace, carefully, stopping when he needed to. He didn't ask permission before he started something, but he didn't overstep. He mended the fence, oiled the barn door hinges that had been shrieking since June, and one afternoon he and Owen stood together at the workbench for 2 hours, fixing the gas line on the old generator, Owen handing him tools in silence, while Fletcher explained each step without making it sound like a lesson. Sophie, for her part, had adopted him the way she adopted everything she considered worth keeping. She told him about her teacher at school, about the rabbit warren behind the east field, about a song she was learning on the recorder. Fletcher listened to all of it with the same patient attention he gave the fence posts, and when she asked him if he'd ever had kids, he was quiet for a moment. No, he said. We wanted them. It just didn't happen. Sophie nodded very seriously. That's sad, she said. It was, he agreed. But some things turn out to matter differently than you thought they would. Sophie seemed satisfied with that. She went back to her recorder. Miriam watched it from across the yard, shielded her eyes against the afternoon sun, and turned back to the garden before he could see her watching. It was the second week when the truck pulled up. Miriam heard it first, tires on gravel, moving too fast for a neighborly visit. She stepped out of the barn to find a silver pickup parked crooked near the gate, and a man already climbing out. Broad, well-dressed, in the particular way of men who wanted you to notice the quality of their clothes without looking like they were trying. He had papers in his hand. His name was Crawford. He worked for an agricultural investment company out of Red Deer. He'd written twice over the summer. She hadn't written back. "Mrs. Voss," he said pleasantly, the way a man says something pleasant when he's decided already that pleasantness is a tool. "I'd like 10 minutes. You can have 5, she said. He went through it quickly. The company had made 3 offers now on the Voss land, each one higher than the last. This one, he said, was final. He said the word final the way people say it when they mean it as a threat dressed in a suit. They knew the harvest had been difficult. They were prepared to move fast, close before the November payment came due. He said the word opportunity a great deal. When he finished, Miriam said, "No, thank you." Crawford looked at her with a patience that wasn't patience at all. "Mrs. Voss, I understand there's sentiment involved, but sentiment doesn't service debt. Neither does selling land my husband's family held for 60 years. He smiled thinly. "If you miss the November payment, the bank makes that decision for you, at significantly less favorable terms." She said nothing. He handed her the papers anyway, tipped his head with professional courtesy, and got back in his truck. She stood in the yard after he left, the papers in her hand, and the fields around her felt enormous and entirely too quiet. Fletcher had watched from the side of the barn. She didn't know how long he'd been there. "He come before?" he asked. "He's written." She folded the papers without looking at them. "I didn't think he'd show up in person." "That's what they do when letters don't work," Fletcher said. "What's the shortfall?" She looked at him. He was leaning against the barn wall, arms crossed, watching the road where Crawford's truck had gone. "You don't need to. I'm not offering anything," he said quietly. "I'm asking a question," she told him. The number, she hadn't said it out loud to anyone, and saying it to a man she'd known 2 weeks felt strange and, somehow, less heavy than she'd expected. He nodded. He didn't say it wasn't so bad, or that she'd figure it out. He said, "Okay," and walked back toward the generator. That night she couldn't sleep. She stood at the kitchen window at 2 in the morning, watching the frost collect on the grass in the dark, thinking about the November payment and the company in Red Deer, and what it meant to lose something you'd never quite known how much you needed until you were about to lose it. She thought about Colin. She thought about his father's hands on the same fence posts Fletcher had repaired this week. She thought about Sophie asking if the man in the ditch was dead, and her own voice saying, "No, he's not dead," with a certainty she'd had no right to feel. In the morning, Fletcher was already up when she came downstairs. He was on the phone in the yard, standing by the old oak near the water pump, speaking in a low, steady voice. He finished when he saw her put the phone in his pocket. "Who were you calling?" she asked. "My brother-in-law," he said. "He's a contractor, buys and holds agricultural land. I wanted his opinion on something." She looked at him carefully. "Fletcher, I haven't done anything," he said. "I wanted information. That's all." "Information about what?" He met her eyes. "About whether there's another way through November." She was quiet for a long time. The frost was burning off in the morning sun. Owen crossed the yard behind her, glancing at Fletcher, then at her, then away with the careful tact of a 12-year-old who'd learned when not to ask. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "No," Fletcher agreed. "I don't." The pause that followed was the kind that fills a room even when you're standing outside. "But I'd like to help," he said, "if you'll let me." There was something in the way he said it. not with the urgency of a man who needed to rescue something, but with the steadiness of a man who'd decided to show up and meant it. She thought of what Sophie had told her that morning at breakfast. "He talks to the chickens." "Mum, he actually talks to them. I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for 2 days. On the 3rd day, she told him yes. What followed was not a dramatic solution. It was slow and complicated and involved more phone calls than she'd expected, and 2 trips to town, and 1 meeting with her own lawyer, a woman named Greta Finch who'd known Miriam since before Colin died and looked at Fletcher Dade with professional skepticism, and then, gradually, something closer to respect. Fletcher's brother-in-law, a man named Art who drove up from Lacombe with a thermos of coffee and the quiet energy of someone who could read a piece of land the way other people read a book, walked the property for 2 hours and came back with numbers that were different from Crawford's numbers. Not because he was being generous. There were options. Not easy ones, but real ones. The November payment could be met. The farm could stay. Crawford came back once more, 3 weeks later. He pulled up in the same truck at the same time of day, as if he'd scheduled himself into her life. Miriam met him at the gate. Fletcher stood on the porch behind her, arms folded, not moving. Crawford clocked him immediately. His composure adjusted in a way that was almost imperceptible, but wasn't. "Mrs. Voss, I was hoping we could continue our conversation." "It's already finished," she said. He smiled the same thin smile. "The offer has an expiry, of course." "I know," Miriam said. "So does my patience." Crawford looked past her to Fletcher. Fletcher said nothing. He simply looked back. Whatever Crawford had calculated about this farm, about this woman alone at the end of a gravel road, it no longer added up the way it had. He nodded once. He got in his truck. He drove away and didn't come back. Miriam turned around. Fletcher was already going back inside. That evening, after the children were in bed, she and Fletcher sat on the porch steps in the last of the autumn light. The temperature was dropping. The fields had gone silver at the edges. Somewhere out past the east fence, a coyote was calling, low and long. "You're going to leave soon," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a thing she'd been holding for a while. "I have a project starting up near Edson in 2 weeks," he said. It was planned before any of this. She nodded. "I meant to be gone before now," he said. "I know," she said. The coyote called again. Owen's light was still on upstairs, orange against the dark. Sophie had left her rubber boots by the door again, one tipped sideways. "You don't have to do anything with that information," Fletcher said. She looked at him. "What information?" He looked down at his hands, then out toward the tree line. "I could come back, in the spring if you wanted. After Edson." The way he said it, carefully, without expectation, like a man who had learned to offer things without insisting on them, made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected and couldn't quite name. "You'd have to ask Owen," she said. "I know," he said. "And Sophie would make you talk to the chickens again." "I don't mind the chickens." She looked at him for a long moment. He was watching the fields, his profile still against the fading sky, and she thought about the man Sophie had found in the ditch, half buried in dead grass, and how it had seemed at the time like a problem that had landed on her front step. How she'd approached it the way she approached everything now. Practically, without sentiment, because there was no room left in her life for sentiment. She had been wrong about that. "Come back in the spring," she said. He turned to look at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, the stillness in his face broke open a little. Not into anything loud, just into warmth. "I will," he said. He left on a Tuesday morning, the kind of clear October day that Alberta gives you once or twice before winter closes in for good. Owen shook his hand. Sophie gave him a drawing she'd made of the farm. Done in green crayon, the farmhouse too big for the paper, the barn leaning slightly, and told him he could keep it. Fletcher folded it very carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. Miriam walked him to his truck. He'd found it 2 kilometers up the road where he'd driven it into the ditch the night he'd been hurt, and it had only needed a new front tire and a battery jump to run again. He put his bag in the back and stood by the driver's door. "Thank you," he said, "for pulling me out of that ditch." "Sophie pulled you out of that ditch," Miriam said. "I just didn't put you back." He laughed then, a short, real sound she hadn't heard from him before. It changed his face. She watched his truck go down the gravel road until it turned onto the highway and disappeared, and then she went back to the kitchen and made a second cup of tea and sat with it in the quiet for a good long while. The winter was hard, the way Alberta winters always are. Not dramatically, just persistently, the cold settling in and refusing to be argued with. Miriam kept the farm going. She paid the November loan with Art's arrangement, a short lease on the east field that cost her nothing she needed and bought her the time she needed. She drove Owen to hockey practice twice a week. She helped Sophie with her recorder until Sophie was playing it in tune, and Miriam could almost hear the difference. She got one letter from Fletcher. It arrived in January, the handwriting deliberate, the words sparse the way his speech was. He'd gotten to Edson. The project had expanded. He was well. He hoped the winter wasn't too brutal. He asked about the fence posts. She wrote back. She told him the fence posts were holding. She told him Owen had scored a goal at the last game and had been so surprised he'd stopped skating for a full second. She told him Sophie had named one of the chickens Fletcher, and that it was the one that wouldn't stay in the yard. She didn't write anything else. She didn't need to. Spring came the way it always does in Alberta. Slowly, and then all at once, the creek running high, the ground releasing itself from the cold in stages. Miriam planted the kitchen garden in May. Owen stretched 3 inches over the winter, and seemed both pleased and confused about it. Sophie learned 2 new songs on the recorder, and performed them in the living room with the gravity of a concert hall debut. It was a Saturday morning in late May when she heard tires on the gravel. She was in the garden, knees in the dirt, a trowel in her hand. She didn't look up right away. She heard Sophie drop something inside. A clatter, then running feet. Heard the screen door bang open. "He's here!" Sophie shouted at a volume that sent the chickens into a brief panic. Miriam stood. She brushed the dirt from her knees. Took off her garden gloves one finger at a time. Fletcher's truck was parked by the gate. He was out of it already, and Sophie had run the length of the yard and attached herself to him the way she attached herself to things she'd decided weren't leaving. He was laughing again, that short reel laugh, his hand on top of her head. Owen came out of the barn. He walked up to Fletcher and held out his hand, and Fletcher shook it without making it a thing. And then Owen said something quiet that made Fletcher nod, and they walked together toward the barn, like they had something to see to. Miriam crossed the yard. Fletcher saw her coming and stopped. He looked different. Not thinner or heavier or older, just more himself somehow, like the winter had settled something in him that had been uncertain before. "The fence posts are holding," she said. "I can see that," he said. She stopped a few feet from him. The morning sun came over the roofline of the barn and lit up the yard warm and gold, and the creek was running somewhere out past the east field, and the chicken Sophie had named Fletcher was, true to form, already on the wrong side of the gate. "I should warn you," Miriam said. "Owen's going to put you to work before lunch." "Good," Fletcher said. "And Sophie's been working on a new song." "I'll survive," he said. She looked at him steadily. He looked back, and in his face was the same thing she'd first seen in the spare room when he'd been pale and exhausted and she'd told him to get some rest. Something careful and real, the kind of thing that doesn't perform itself but just is. "Then come in," she said. "The coffee's on." He picked up his bag. She held the gate open, and he walked through it, and the morning, held them both like something that had been waiting a long time to be ordinary. Some things don't arrive like thunder. They arrive like spring. Patient, quiet, rooting themselves into ground that had nearly forgotten what it meant to thaw.